There's a moment in every economic collapse when people realize something is terribly wrong with their money. At first, it's subtle. Prices rise a little faster than expected. Groceries cost slightly more this week than last week. A cup of coffee feels strangely expensive, but then something shifts. Prices stop rising slowly and begin jumping violently. A paycheck that once covered a month of living barely survives a few days. Savings built over decades suddenly feel fragile, and eventually the truth becomes unavoidable. The currency itself is collapsing. Hyperinflation is one of the most destructive economic forces in history. It doesn't just raise prices, it dismantles entire economies. It erases savings, destabilizes governments, and destroys the trust that holds a financial system together. When hyperinflation takes hold, money stops behaving like money. Instead of being a stable store of value, it becomes a rapidly melting asset that people rush to spend before it loses even more worth. To understand how devastating hyperinflation can be, it helps to start with one of the most famous examples in modern history, Germany in the early 1920s. After the First World War, Germany was struggling under enormous economic pressure. The country had lost the war, its industrial regions were damaged, and it was forced to pay massive reparations to the victorious Allied powers. The German government faced a difficult problem. It needed money to rebuild the country and pay its obligations, but the economy was weak and tax revenue was insufficient. Instead of raising taxes or cutting spending dramatically, the government chose a simpler solution: printing more money. At first, this seemed like a manageable strategy. Increasing the money supply allowed the government to pay workers, fund projects, and meet some of its debts. But the effect of printing money is rarely immediate. It begins slowly, almost invisibly, before accelerating. By 1921 and 1922, prices in Germany were rising rapidly. People noticed their savings losing value, and businesses began raising prices to keep up with the falling currency. The German mark was losing purchasing power at an alarming rate. Then, in 1923, the system completely broke. Hyperinflation took over the German economy with breathtaking speed. Prices doubled not over years, but over days, sometimes even hours. Workers were paid multiple times per day so they could rush out and spend their wages before the money became worthless. Stories from the period sound almost unbelievable. People carried stacks of banknotes in wheelbarrows just to buy bread. Children played with bundles of currency like toys because the paper was cheaper than actual playthings. In some cases, restaurant menus stopped listing prices entirely because they changed too quickly to print. For the middle class, the consequences were catastrophic. Families who had saved responsibly for decades saw their life savings reduced to nothing. Pensioners who relied on fixed incomes suddenly found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. Years of financial security vanished in a matter of months. But the damage went far beyond personal finances. Hyperinflation destroyed the structure of the entire economy. Businesses struggled to operate because they couldn't predict prices. Contracts became meaningless since payments agreed upon today might be worthless by the time they were made. Banks lost credibility, loans collapsed, and long-term planning became nearly impossible. The most dangerous consequence, however, was the collapse of trust. Money works because people believe it will hold value tomorrow. When that belief disappears, the entire economic system begins to unravel. People stop saving and start spending immediately. Barter begins to replace currency. Foreign currencies become more desirable than the local one. Germany eventually stabilized its currency in late 1923 by introducing a new form of money backed by real assets and strict limits on printing. But by then, the damage had already been done. The middle class had been wiped out, social stability had eroded, and the political consequences would shape Europe for decades. The lesson from Germany is simple but powerful. Once hyperinflation begins, it becomes extremely difficult to stop. And Germany was far from the only country to experience this economic disaster. Zimbabwe's central bank responded by printing larger and larger banknotes. Bills worth millions, then billions, and eventually trillions of Zimbabwean dollars were issued. But increasing the size of the numbers didn't solve the underlying problem. A $100 trillion banknote could barely buy a loaf of bread. At that point, the currency had effectively stopped functioning. Businesses refused to accept it, citizens turned to foreign currencies like the US dollar, and barter trade began reappearing in everyday life. The economy shrank dramatically as factories closed, unemployment surged, and public services collapsed. Hyperinflation didn't just make life expensive, it dismantled the entire structure of economic activity. Zimbabwe eventually abandoned its currency entirely and allowed foreign money to circulate freely. That decision stabilized prices, but the economic damage lingered for years. Another example comes from Venezuela in the late 2010s. Once one of the wealthiest countries in South America due to its massive oil reserves, Venezuela entered a severe economic crisis after a combination of falling oil prices, government mismanagement, and heavy reliance on money printing. As government revenue collapsed, the central bank dramatically expanded the money supply to finance spending. Just like in previous hyperinflation crises, the effects began slowly before spiraling out of control. By 2018, inflation in Venezuela had reached levels so extreme that prices were rising thousands of percent per year. Grocery stores struggled to stock basic items. Citizens spent hours waiting in lines for essentials like bread, rice, or cooking oil. Savings lost nearly all value, and millions of people fled the country in search of stability elsewhere. Across these different countries and decades, the pattern of hyperinflation looks strikingly similar. First, governments face a financial crisis. Spending obligations exceed revenue, and political leaders search for solutions that avoid painful decisions like raising taxes or cutting programs. Second, the government turns to money creation as a temporary fix. Printing money allows spending to continue without immediate consequences. Third, inflation begins rising. At first, it appears manageable, but as confidence in the currency weakens, the process accelerates rapidly. Finally, once people lose trust in the currency entirely, hyperinflation erupts. At that point, stabilizing the economy becomes extremely difficult without drastic reforms. The underlying cause is always the same: too much money chasing too few goods. When governments create large amounts of currency without increasing the real production of goods and services, each unit of money represents a smaller share of the economy. Prices must rise to reflect that imbalance. But the real danger is psychological. Inflation becomes hyperinflation when people expect prices to keep rising and begin acting accordingly. Workers demand higher wages, businesses raise prices in advance, consumers rush to spend money before it loses value. These behaviors create a feedback loop that drives prices higher and higher. In that sense, hyperinflation is not just an economic event, it's a societal shock that reshapes nations, destroys financial security, and forces people to rethink what money really is. Because when money stops working, the entire system built around it begins to fall apart. Understanding hyperinflation isn't just an academic exercise, it's a warning from history about what happens when trust in money disappears and entire economies collapse. By studying these lessons, you can see the importance of real value, resilience, and planning in protecting your wealth. If you found this perspective useful and want to see more stories from history that reveal the hidden rules of money, hit subscribe. History doesn't just repeat, It teaches, and I'll show you exactly where to look.